So the purpose of this agenda item is really to be transparent and involve y'all in the conversation. There is no legal requirement that says we must adopt any of these financial policies. Instead, what we've elected to do is start the conversation and have y'all, as we mentioned earlier in a previous agenda item, start looking at those things that are legislated or mandated by local government code, and then see where our policies need to be more tightened up or put in more rules, regulations, or processes that we didn't previously have codified. I do want to make it a point to say that the ones that are here tonight, the very first one, the financial policies, that will be the update that is included in the annual budget document every year. That's very basic, standard boilerplate stuff, and I'll go through all of these individually. The other four, though, have to do more with making sure that we're all clear about authority and authorization. So that's been a hot button topic for this council, for staff here. And what we did was we looked at a lot of those things where we're seeing maybe some internal control issues. We were having differing interpretations of that general law that may have applied. And we were also seeing a lot of, well, that's how we've always done it. So we wanted to take that next step and make sure that we had sound financial policies in place that we can push out and have them be consistent and have them be something that we can enforce.
Casey, look, thanks for putting this together and for putting on the agenda. You'll quickly find out, as passionate as Tim is on security matters, that'll be me on financial matters. I did take note here that you say there's no requirement that these be approved. But honestly, I think all 5 of these attachments should be brought forward to the budget every single year and have approval sought. I think these are critical documents, and I think these are policy pieces I know personally I've been asking for over a year, and these are a long time in the making, so thanks for bringing them. But I think they're really important, and they do go hand in hand with the budget.
I agree with that, and we can build that into our process just to make it a routine thing where we share any necessary updates, come back every year as part of that budget process. All right, and so moving on to the very first one, as I said, this is going to be our overarching financial policy. This really just gives us some rules and regulations on basic overall financial things. What is the basis of accounting and budget? Do we have to adopt an annual budget? What does that mean for the town? What are our different fund balance policies? What is our stance on debt service? When do we issue debt? How much debt are we finding to be palatable for our town? And then what's the expectation on financial reporting? So again, these are things that we're just trying to make sure that we're codifying. That way we can be held accountable to it.
Yeah, can I just, so on this financial policies, just looking here at the policy statement, which is kind of the introduction to this whole piece, it says that these are reviewed and updated periodically by the town manager, head of school, and director of finance. Did you get input on these from the acting head of school?
I did.
Okay. It also says that the financial policy, along with any other policies enacting or defining authority granted, will be presented to the council board for approval of any significant changes. So my understanding here is this is an internal policy, and again, this is just me speaking for me. I think this should be a council-led policy. I think any changes should be brought to council, but I think council should approve these documents every single year.
Okay. And so we can clarify that language, either striking out the word significant. Really, it was put in there just to say if we catch a typo, we don't want to.
No, I understand, but the same point is with the scope. It's still lacking the wording approval of council. It says policies and procedures are the responsibility of staff. I think proposed amendments should be made by staff, but I do think these do require approval.
Okay. And then in the rest of this policy, as I said, we talk about the basis of accounting and budgeting, just that we're GASB friendly, that we do an annual budget every year. We have a process. We adhere to Local Government Code 102 for the state of Texas. And then we also in here, and you'll see this in some of the other policies, what we try to do in a lot of these is if we saw an opportunity to unify the policy and the application of it between the town and the academy, we took that opportunity so that we're not operating under different sets of rules. You will see a difference whenever it comes to budgetary policy, and that mostly has to do with the fiscal year differences and the timing, and then also how our major funding mechanisms work. If you'll recall, the school's major funding mechanism comes from state money, whereas the town, a lot of ours is local taxes, be it property or sales. In here also we have fund balance policies, and these are things that we can continue having conversations about throughout the upcoming fiscal year, particularly whenever we're talking about dollars that we are seeing come in and dollars that we're planning to have go out. Different fund types have really different purposes, so making sure that we're enumerating that in our conversations is critical so that we also understand what the expectation is on when we would bring a proposal to use any kind of fund balance and what we need in reserves.
Yeah, can I just because you're moving through these sequentially, I just want to back up to the budget, the annual budget. I think here under budget amendments, it says adjustments for purchases must adhere to the appropriate purchasing authority policy, which obviously is critical. It should. It says budget adjustments may not increase or decrease the appropriation amounts approved within the adopted budget. But I think we've already been seeing examples where there's requests to be able to amend the budget. So this seems to be in conflict with the purchasing authority policy. So we should just verify that.
So in that particular section, the terminology difference that we're making there is amendment versus adjustment. An amendment is a formal legal action taken by this board, where an adjustment is more of a transfer. If I thought I was going to spend $20 here, but it ended up being $25, I'm going to have to source $5 from a different account within my purview.
We can talk about it here because that's the exact point I'm going to raise here when we get to the purchase authority.
Okay, sounds good. All right, and then moving over to the debt service. A lot of this language has been taken from previous debt service language that has been presented as part of the budget document. And a lot of it also incorporates new stuff that maybe we haven't been clear on in the past. One thing I do want to make it a point to say is one of the things that we made sure to build into this debt service process is the conversation around refinancing and what that process is. We work with our financial advisor. They're monitoring rates at a minimum a monthly basis, and then they're comparing the market to what it is we have outstanding, and they're advising to us whether or not it's a good time to refinance or to hold. And then the last thing on here has to do with the financial reporting, and the language in here really is more focused on the annual financial, the ACFR, the Comprehensive Financial Report, and not so much the different quarterly reports that are required by other legislation. And again, this policy, the financial policy specifically, will be included in the budget document whenever it's published. Now, going over into the next 4 policies that we have here, the purchasing authority is the first one, and this is the one I expect a lot of conversation around. What we did here for all of these dollar thresholds that you'll see in any of these, we tried to align them most closely with the local government code as far as purchasing laws go. That way, again, trying to think about any time that we can have one single number in everybody's brain and not have a bunch of different kind of measures of how we do things in this process versus another. So what we're looking at here for the purchasing authority, first of all, we actually define what we're going to consider authorized spending. So that means that you don't get to buy whatever you would like. We do have line item details for the town budget where we can go in and say this is our plan. We also understand that plans are just that, and they can change. And so we need to be responsive to that and have a process in place about what it is we consider okay to go forward, when we consider it an appropriate time for staff to make a decision, and then what does that process look like as far as whenever what we need to do doesn't adhere into what's expected or normal, and how can we be communicating that and getting approval from this board? So looking at the actual spending thresholds, we did break it down into 2 buckets, budgeted purchases and unbudgeted purchases. The thresholds that we are using, and again, you'll see these in the different policies, is this up to $3,000 mark. The $3,000 mark there is from the purchasing code from the state, and it says basically if your good or service is under $3,000, you don't need a purchasing mechanism that's viable in order to purchase it. You can swipe your P card, you can use whomever you choose as far as vendors go without doing a lot of extra due diligence. Once you get to 3,000, and this is according to state law, so the 3,000 to 50,000 says you need a reason to buy it, whether it's 3 quotes, if the purchase is already under a contract, interlocal agreement, sole source, what have you. But you can't just use whomever you
But
like.
we're talking about budgeted purchases here, right?
For this purpose, the purchase is different from the purchasing method. So the purchasing method where we are using these, or where we're sourcing these $3,000, $5,000, or $50,000 thresholds, that has to do with how you purchase. We're just going to apply it here too. That way, again, we're using similar numbers whenever we can. So for budgeted and unbudgeted purchases, we're still using those same thresholds of the 0 to 3 and then 3 to 50. There's just different mechanisms that we're putting in place.
Between,
So for the budgeted purchases,
Yeah.
effectively what we've done is say that up to $3,000, department heads or principals have spending authority.
right,
As
this
long
is
as
what I'm
that's-
trying to differentiate between budgeted and unbudgeted, what these threshold limits are.
Right. So really, there's no difference in the thresholds. It's the activities
Correct.
that are lining up with what
Well,
happens.
one's been pre-approved by council, the other has not. And this
Correct.
is what I'm trying to differentiate between the two. So on the budgeted purchases, this is something that's already come through as a line item. Council's already reviewed it, approved it in the annual budget, and what we're saying is that a department head or a principal can spend up to $3,000 on said item that's been identified in the budget without additional approval.
Correct.
Yeah, which is fine. And then your next threshold is up to $19,999.99, so just under $20,000. And we're saying the head of school has the authority to approve purchases for Westlake Academy as long as, again, they had already been identified in the budget. And what I would like to move for is that the same threshold applies to the town manager, which is in keeping with what it was at Trophy Club. And we set the same limits because head of school and the town manager have pretty similar budgets. And that we require anything over and above 20 and up would have come to an open meeting and have formal board approval for the item.
What about commingling of funds too? So we had that issue where people would take their 3,000 and then someone else's 3,000 to get over the threshold.
So that would fall under the unbudgeted, and that's a good point. And
Well-
actually, I've got that note here.
And to that comment, that may not necessarily fall under unbudgeted. I do have language in the prohibited or restricted scenario. That's what is legally referred to as sequential purchasing. Effectively, the law says if a reasonable person was making a purchase and there was no fund restriction, you had all the money in the world, would a reasonable person make this purchase in one go?
That's in the next whole section, the prohibited or restricted activities.
Correct.
Right.
All right.
So that's on the budgeted purchases, right? And I think what we should do as a council, and I don't know if this has to come back as an agenda item, I don't know what the formality is, but I think we should get this marked up and brought back for formal approval.
We
by
can
council.
absolutely share
I think
this
it should be
and
adopted
have
as part of the budget.
a red line that is circulated. Again, these wouldn't be included in the budget document right now, and they are very much open for discussion. And then the next section here is about the unbudgeted purchases. And you'll notice that there's a lot more language about what to do as far as if something happens. We do have in here language that says if it's up to that $3,000 and you can make a corresponding cut, then we'll present it to y'all, but we're allowing the department heads, the principals, town manager, and the head of school to understand what's best for their particular organizations and departments and not slow them down if there is something that needs to change from that plan. We'll come back to council and we'll be reporting on those, absolutely. And we can also do something along the lines of ratifying retroactively. Again, all up to y'all and part of this conversation.
And what would be the penalty if people made a corresponding cut to get something through, and then at the end of the year was, hey, we're going to do it anyway? I mean, actually, this happens in the FBI every year. They overspend their budget, and the last day they go to Congress and they drop a letter to them saying, basically, screw. So, is there any penalty, or is it just a...
That would go through the normal disciplinary process for the town.
Okay.
On the unbudgeted purchases, so I think that makes sense. Anything up to 3,000, as long as there's a commensurate, reduction to cover the unforeseen expenditure, I think it's fine as long as it immediately comes to council for them to approve after the fact. I think the same thing, just coming to your next section here, is the head of school and the town manager have also similar authority, but I think, again, they should both be set at just under the $20,000 threshold. And I think, again, it's what this says here, is there should be a reduction in an expenditure in equal amount to compensate. I think what we need to define is what that is, going back to prior point about where that money comes from. And I think we need to very carefully define it, because what we don't want is money coming from an unrelated fund to come in and cover an unforeseen expenditure. It's got to be something that is very, very similarly defined. And so, for example, when we talk about these backflow preventers, we have insufficient funds in that line item, but we had sufficient funds in general repairs and maintenance. That might be an okay definition of moving funds to cover something on a temporary basis. But I think that's the language we should strive for. And then anything over and above 20,000, I think, should come to council. As it's unbudgeted, it was unforeseen, and I think council should have the opportunity to hear about it and decide.
But, for example, we define budget versus budget authority. So, for example, we had training in the school for $120,000.
Well, this is going to get onto a much broader point, which I was going to save until we get into the actual budget. But I think if there is training, if there's the hiring of a consultant, if there's a purchase of a product, I think if it's a budgeted item, this should be a clearly delineated and defined product or service in the budget.
I agree.
If not, it's going to be classified as unbudgeted.
Correct.
And so when I had asked previously about having a list of outside consultants, again, I'll save this till we get into the actual budget details, that was the purpose of doing so. So if a consultant is to be hired, you can point and protect yourselves and say, look, it was on the list, we had identified this party, and we have the authority now to go ahead and hire them because it's within our threshold, and if it's not, it's still a budgeted item. But I think what I'm trying to do is get to a point where we're trying to clean up this sort of gray area where it's not so clear what these authority limits are.
Correct. And so what we have done as part of the line item detail is if there were any dollars requested on the town side for the upcoming budget, they all had to effectively be justified. And so within each account, if it's $100, if it's $100,000, every single expenditure has some sort of description that says what this is. If it's office supplies or if it's a list of consultants, we have all of that codified already so that we can be looking to this policy for those budgeted purchases.
And Casey, since you've been here, I mean, like, what you're talking about is in principle is wonderful, but since you've been here, head of school bought training that was not approved. Mm-hmm. There was some network recording, phone call recording software that was bought that was not approved. So since you've been here, that type of stuff has
Consultants have been hired who are not
consultants.
identified.
We're just trying to tighten it up, and what people just forget, like, oh, we got a brand new credit card, let's go spend. Mm-hmm. We're still 48 or 50 million in the hole. We're trying to dig out of a hole. So could this loosen up in a year or two or three? You bet. But right now, we're trying to dig out of this hole that we inherited, and there's 3 or 4 examples that have happened. Not that it's your job to be cop on it, but have happened since you've been here. So it does happen, and that's what we're trying to crank down on, and that's where our frustration lies.
Yeah.
So we have a similar approach then. So what the organization had not done previously is this type of discussion where they're looking and saying, what is it that we are budgeting for? We had a lot of missing documentation as far as budgets that have been approved by
Casey,
previous councils.
I want this personally to go beyond just a discussion. I want this, again, my request to be redlined and given to council so they can see it, and I'd like us to adopt it. So I want to make sure, and I'm happy to do the markups with you. I have extensive notes throughout these policies. But I really feel this is important, especially in light of us looking to approve a budget here. I don't want to take over from your presentation, but I'm just, the next thing on the list here is emergency purchases, which is very timely because this just came up again with the backflow preventer. And I understand, Wade, you want to adopt this definition of an emergency purchase, which is, brought by local government code section 252. And because I have nothing better to do, I pulled up section 252. And this is the section which talks about purchasing and contracting authority of a municipality, and you're relying on the general exemptions. And I just want to give a couple of examples what would theoretically exempt these policies for a potential purchase by the town manager. One is a public calamity. No idea what that is. Another would be a procurement necessary because of unforeseen damage to public machinery, equipment, or property. It could be a procurement for personal, professional, or planning services. It could be a procurement for work that is performed and paid for by the day as the work progresses. It could be a purchase of land or a right-of-way. It could be a procurement of items that are available from only one source. It could be a purchase of rare books, papers, and other library materials. My point is that standard, in my opinion, is too broad. And I think when we use the word emergency procedures to sidestep a financial policy to make an expenditure, wait, my only point about bringing this backflow preventer to council was because this is what I want to avoid. I understand if there's a true emergency and you have to make that last minute decision and we have no choice, I get that, but this is too broad. And I think we need to better define what that emergency standard is. And in the very first moment that you can bring it back to council for justification, I think that's a good standard to be held to. And I don't think it's unreasonable.
I agree.
Absolutely. We agree with that 100%. And the hard part about putting a specific definition is every emergency is going to be a little different. So
Absolutely.
It will have to be broad enough where we can fit things that are absolutely going to affect the life and safety of our citizens, that will absolutely affect, a great example, you lose both fire trucks. Well, I got to make a repair on a fire truck, right? Because if we can't make calls, that's a life and safety.
I know, but that can fit under emergency. The mayor can call a meeting in 2 hours, right? Right? Isn't that an emergency that the fire trucks are out? We could just move on that. And a true emergency is defined on that already.
I think, Stan, I think you weighing in, obviously not now, but in terms of the language, you understand, we're just trying to, I would like to try to get this tightened up so we have very workable policy. And,
We're definitely not trying to sidestep any policies, David. We just need to get the definitions where we all agree to them, and we'll abide by them. We'll definitely bring back anything that we deem an emergency or that falls within the scope or definition of emergency that we have. We'll bring those back to council for ratification, just so that you can see every single time that we're not abusing that right.
yeah, Casey, you're welcome to continue going through the presentation. Those are my major points. The prohibited or restricted activities are all pretty much common sense. Just don't buy alcohol and, other things that are just don't make sense.
Sadly, we have to write some common sense things down just to help everybody bull their strike.
Yeah, I had no other comments on that one. And then on the contract authority,
And I do want to start on the contract authority. The intent here is to be good partners for our vendors. We don't want our vendors acting in good faith and using implicit authority to provide a gooder service.
No, I understand. I'm just trying to go back through my notes here briefly because, again, we can mark this up and recirculate, and I think we should do this, on a timely basis. But here under authorized contracts, it says not all purchases require a contract. Those purchases allowed to be made without a contract will be excluded from this policy. Again, that's a very gray area because what you're saying is if you commit verbally to something, then it may be able to sidestep this policy. So I think these are just small things, but I think there is some cleaning up to do on this. And then there's a last section here on administration of contracts. And it says contract administration and maintenance is the responsibility of the contract administrator. This includes council board approval as necessary. Is there any provision, Stan, where we can have these contracts, in light of what we've heard today, voided if they didn't go through the proper policy authorization? For example, if one were to sign a lease amendment without seeking proper approval, can it be voided, or is that just a matter of law at that point?
Well, I think the distinction is voiding it internally versus voiding it with the.
Correct.
That's a different animal. Case it down.
Okay. And then my only last question, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sidestep your presentation, you're welcome to go through it, was on the procurement card administration, because this relates to a lot of staff members who have the authority to use cards to purchase. Is there an acknowledgement by staff to accept this?
So that will be part of our internal policy going forward. We're
Okay.
working on crafting not only an acceptance of the policy, but also an annual update with training. It's one of those areas that have been lacking previously, and it's important for not only us, but also for the card holder to be protected.
They sign something every year acknowledging the policy.
Correct.
Mr. Quinn, I don't know that that's ever been done in the past, honestly, but that's something that we're moving forward with. So
Sorry, say that again, which part?
I'm not sure that that was ever done in the past. I don't think that our employees ever signed anything that said that they agree to hold themselves to these policies, but that will be done moving forward.
Yeah, agreed. Okay.
You want to keep going through this, or do you want to say?
This is all my comments on this particular section. As I said, if council wants to hear the rest of the presentation, I'm sorry for hijacking. Those are very
We have
specific
a lot of
points.
other things. You want to bring this back, or?
I think it needs to be marked up and brought back, and I think a red line version to council would be very helpful if council agrees.
I agree.
Why don't
I agree.
We'll redline it and bring it back for later.
Sounds great.
All right.
Thanks,
Get to
Casey.
motion that.
No, we don't. She was just doing a briefing. No action on it.
Thank you. David, thanks for doing all that work.
Thank you, David.
Of course.
I just want to, before we do the budget, just close out executive session. Do you want to go crank into that real quick, or do you want to hit budget first? Executive? Executive? What do you guys want to do? Executive or budget?
Let's do executive.
All right, let's go close into executive session. We're going to be doing 23-224. Town council will conduct a closed session pursuant to Texas Government Code, annotated Chapter 551, Chapter D. For the following, Section 551.074, Alpha 1, deliberation regarding personnel matters, to deliberate regarding Wesley Academy Head of School, and Bravo, Section 551.074.2, consultation with attorney seek advice regarding admissions policy for Westlake Academy. And now we're breaking at executive session for 7:40.